Performing social research is definitely one of the core components of doing any sociology. In this unit, we're going to look a little bit about how we go about doing research in sociology and talk about some of the fundamental principles. For us, I want to start with something that's actually not in your textbook, and that's really the wheel of science. This is essentially the notion that theory and research are constantly engaging one another throughout the process. The good thing about doing any social research, you can start anywhere on this wheel, meaning that you may have observations, things you're seeing in society, and you may think, let me look at those a bit further, let me look for some patterns and go to empirical generalizations. If you were to start with those observations, moving then into some generalizations, and then trying to look for theories to validate that, that's essentially doing what we call inductive research or the induction process. If you start on the other side with theories, like you have an idea as to, hey, I think this is what goes on, you develop those into hypotheses and then have observations, that's deduction. So as you see on both sides of the wheel, it's a constantly moving cycle where you can either start with your observations, you can start with your theories, but either way, they're going to guide one another, that you can't just make observations unless you wrap them in theory, and you can't just have theories unless they're actually grounded in observations. So keep that in mind as kind of the grounding of how we approach social science research for sure, and then a number of other topics as well. So developing your research questions, certainly a large portion of the text will talk about this. Your hypothesis is a testable statement about the relationship between two or more variables. So again, a testable statement about the relationship between two or more empirical variables. Well, what the heck is a variable? Well, variable is anything that can change or vary. So your book will get into some complicated terms all about this, but I want to start to break it down and explore variables and hopefully help you to understand them a bit better. So to do that, I want to use a few sample hypotheses. So here we have two basic hypotheses. They're not necessarily true and accurate and tested, they're just two hypotheses. The first is the less you smoke cigarettes, the longer you will live. And the second is the more McDonald's cheeseburgers you eat, the more obese you'll become. So as we start to look at these two hypotheses, and we know hypotheses has to do with variables and their relationship between them, let's start with the first one of the less you smoke cigarettes, the longer you will live. What do we think the variables in this statement are? Well, the first variable is there, the less you smoke, or the frequency of your smoking, right? It can vary. Your frequency of smoking can be high, it could be low, it could be none. So that's one variable. The second variable is your life expectancy, or the longer you will live, shown here in the green. So in this statement, or this hypothesis, you see that the less you smoke, variable 1, the longer you will live, variable 2. Those two things can vary. What the book then talks about is a real key distinction, which is which one is the dependent variable and which one is the independent variable. If you think about in this statement, how long you live, your life expectancy, depends upon the frequency of smoking cigarettes in this particular example. Cigarettes is independent because the amount you're smoking is going to be completely not dependent then on how you will live. Instead, it's how long you will live dependent on how much you're smoking. I know that can be very confusing and I know it trips up a lot of folks, so let's look at the other one with the cheeseburgers as well. So the more McDonald's cheeseburgers you eat, the more obese you will become. Here in this statement, let's try and find the variables once again. Here we've got cheeseburgers and obesity. So essentially variable 1 being cheeseburger consumption, the volume or frequency of that, and the second being your body weight or obesity. So here you can see that your obesity would be dependent upon the number of cheeseburgers you're consuming, whereas cheeseburger consumption is actually independent. I know that that can get trippy, and I certainly know that it will pop up throughout our chapter here as well as on the quiz, so be sure to know the difference between identifying the variables, but then also which one's dependent and which one's independent. Even if you have to say it out loud to yourself of this one is going to depend on the other, make sure you're clear on that distinction. So as sociologists, we use a number of research methods to look at social problems. One of them is survey research, another's experiments, open-ended interviews, secondary analysis, and your book goes into a lot more. We're just going to look at these four for right now, but again, certainly look through your text as well. So survey research, right? We've all received those mailers. We've received online surveys these days. They're most common and often used for large groups of populations to sample. It's the go-to method for most sociology, primarily because you can easily quantify a lot of it. The advantage is that it's very quantifiable. Comparisons can be made between the groups, and you often end up with a very large data set. So every question someone answers is one more data point for you to then leverage. The disadvantage of using a survey is that it's really unable to capture the full richness of feelings, attitudes, motivations, those things that underlie people's responses. You want to get at something really, really rich, it's not going to be through a survey. That's something better served through an interview or a focus group. Surveys are where you want to measure something very benign. So maybe it's people's opinion on something that's relatively mild or just kind of an average topic. If you wanted to go into something very personal, very deep, that's where you would not want to use a survey. Instead, you also want to look and consider experiments. Often used more in psychology than sociology, they're very appropriate for testing a very narrow and well-defined variable. The concern is often in sociology, we don't have a lot of very well-defined and narrow variables. Society's complicated. And so while you can use this if you know how to isolate the particular variable and want to control for it, the real disadvantage is that a lab setting is not the real world. The real world has a lot of complexity, many layers of what impacts social change and social interaction. So a lab setting for an experiment may produce results that won't necessarily replicate in the real world. For interviews, again, this is when you're really wanting to probe and get flexible in terms of how you want to dive into particular areas with your subjects or respondents. An advantage of this is that if you use an open-ended interview style, meaning that you can ask a question very broadly, it's not a yes or no, and it leads to much more discussion, you can be flexible. You can make new questions as you go. But that also requires that the interviewer is really well trained and able to actually create those questions on the fly. Without that, it's a very, very tough process to use. Finally, secondary analysis is a great way to start to look at some of your data. This is really where you use artifacts or data that have been collected by other people. So for example, the US Census, they publish all kinds of data. You could use that data set that's already existing, not have to go out and do your own research, and instead draw conclusions from that simply by using the data they've already provided you. It can also be artifacts and other things, but typically it comes from government sources or other large research houses. The advantage is you don't have to do the work of gathering the raw data, you just have to make sense out of it. And in terms of making sense out of your data, your book talks on this, and you'll certainly see it in most math classes, but there are measures of central tendency. They're the most basic of descriptive statistics that we use in order to start to talk about our data, especially in a quantitative way. The first is the mean or the average. That's simply taking the average of all the scores in the set. You also have the median, meaning if you lined up all the numbers from start to end in order, you would take the very middle. And the mode, the most frequently occurring. So if in a data set you have the number 5, the most frequent of all the different values, that would be your mode. So this chapter again was a really brief look at a lot of content, but be sure to review the entire chapter, including ethics on research, sampling types, research bias, causality, and the research process itself. Again, human society is complicated, and I really want to